I remember the moment you realized that something you had believed for years no longer felt as solid as it once did. It may not have been about religion. Maybe it was about a relationship you thought would last forever, a friend you trusted without question, or a family story that turned out to be incomplete. At first you resisted. Your instinct was not to investigate, but to defend. That reaction is deeply human, because our minds are built to protect stability before they pursue truth. We would rather preserve a familiar story than face the uncertainty that comes when its foundations begin to crack. That is why certain questions feel dangerous long before they are answered. They threaten more than information. They threaten identity. And few biblical stories illustrate that tension more than the story of Jonah. For generations it has been told as a straightforward historical account. A prophet runs from God. A violent storm erupts. A great fish swallows him. 3 days later he is alive again. He finally obeys, preaches to the city of Nineveh, and one of the largest cities in the ancient world suddenly repents. It is simple, memorable, dramatic, and emotionally satisfying. But what if that familiarity has hidden a much more difficult question? What if the story was never originally intended to function the way many modern readers assume? What if asking whether Jonah literally spent 3 days inside a giant fish is actually the least interesting question we could ask? Before rejecting that possibility, notice something about the way we evaluate extraordinary claims. Imagine your co-worker arrives on Monday morning and calmly tells everyone that he survived 3 days trapped inside the stomach of a whale before walking home without permanent injuries. Nobody would believe him, not because people enjoy being cynical, but because extraordinary events require extraordinarily strong evidence. Our standards suddenly become very high. We ask for witnesses, medical records, physical evidence, independent confirmation. Yet when the same type of extraordinary event appears inside an ancient sacred text, many people unconsciously lower those standards because the story belongs to a tradition they already trust. Others do the opposite. They dismiss it immediately because it belongs to religion. Both reactions reveal the same psychological habit. We often decide what is true before examining the evidence, then spend our energy defending the conclusion we already wanted. Confirmation bias does not belong exclusively to believers or skeptics. It belongs to human beings. That is what makes this conversation uncomfortable. The question is not simply whether Jonah happened. The question is whether we are capable of separating our emotional attachment to a story from the evidence surrounding it. Historians approach ancient literature differently from the way many modern readers do. They ask what genre a text belongs to. Is it intended as history, poetry, wisdom, literature, satire, parable, theological reflection, or something else? Those distinctions matter because ancient authors often communicated truth through narrative forms that modern audiences no longer instinctively recognize. Nobody reads a proverb expecting a newspaper report. Nobody reads a poem expecting courtroom testimony. The difficulty with Jonah is that scholars have long disagreed about exactly how the book should be understood. Some argue that it preserves an extraordinary historical event. Others see it as a theological narrative, rich with symbolism, irony, and literary artistry, rather than straightforward historical reporting. Still others occupy a middle position, suggesting that historical memories may have inspired a work whose final form intentionally emphasizes theological meaning over historical precision. That disagreement itself should tell us something important. The debate is not the invention of internet skeptics or modern critics trying to attack religion. It has existed because the text itself contains features that invite deeper interpretation. Consider the main character. Jonah is introduced as a prophet, yet he behaves almost as the opposite of what readers expect. Instead of eagerly obeying his divine mission, he runs in the opposite direction. Pagan sailors eventually display more reverence than the prophet. The people of Nineveh, famous in history for violence and imperial power, respond almost instantly with repentance. Even the animals participate in mourning. Then, after what appears to be the greatest missionary success imaginable, Jonah becomes angry because mercy was shown to his enemies. The narrative repeatedly reverses expectations. Nearly everyone acts differently than expected. Even nature appears to participate in the lesson. Storms, plants, worms, winds, and the great fish all seem perfectly obedient, while the prophet alone resists. Many literary scholars have observed that these reversals resemble sophisticated storytelling techniques, designed to expose human pride and prejudice rather than simply record unusual events. That observation does not automatically prove the events never happened, but it does challenge the assumption that literal history is the only meaningful way to read the book. Then there is the famous fish itself. Popular imagination often transforms it into a whale, although the biblical text simply refers to a great sea creature. Over the centuries, countless attempts have been made either to prove or disprove whether a human could survive inside such an animal. Entire debates have focused on stomach acids, oxygen levels, anatomy, and isolated stories that resemble the account. Yet these discussions sometimes miss the larger issue. If the story is presented as a miracle, ordinary biological probability is already suspended. Miracles, by definition, are not expected to follow normal, natural processes. Trying to demonstrate that surviving inside a fish is medically plausible neither proves nor disproves the theological claim. The more important historical question becomes whether independent evidence supports the event itself. Here the evidence becomes much thinner than many people assume. Outside the biblical tradition, there is no contemporary record describing Jonah's famous experience with the fish or Nineveh's citywide repentance. That absence does not necessarily disprove the account, because ancient history is notoriously incomplete. Countless events left no surviving documentation. Still, historians must distinguish between what can be demonstrated and what is believed on the basis of faith or textual tradition. That distinction is intellectually healthy, because certainty should not extend beyond the available evidence. Another intriguing feature is the city of Nineveh itself. Archaeology confirms that Nineveh was indeed a real and enormously important Assyrian city. Its existence is beyond serious dispute. But the biblical description of its dramatic collective repentance raises historical questions. The Assyrian Empire left extensive inscriptions celebrating military victories, royal achievements, construction projects, and political accomplishments. They were masters of self-promotion, yet historians have not discovered Assyrian records describing the sweeping national repentance portrayed in Jonah. Again, silence is not proof that something never occurred. Ancient rulers rarely recorded embarrassing episodes, but responsible historical method acknowledges both what evidence exists and what remains absent. Recognizing those limits is not hostility toward religion. It is simply intellectual consistency. Perhaps the deepest reason this story continues to provoke debate has little to do with archaeology or marine biology. It has everything to do with human psychology. Jonah confronts something that many people secretly fear. He discovers that God may care about people he personally despises. His struggle is not primarily with a fish, it is with mercy. He wants justice for his enemies, not compassion. That emotional conflict feels astonishingly modern. Think about how often people divide the world into deserving and undeserving groups. Political opponents become monsters. Rival communities become irredeemable. Social media rewards outrage far more than understanding. We often believe forgiveness is beautiful until it extends to someone we dislike. Suddenly, grace feels offensive. Whether the story happened exactly as described, or whether it functions as profound theological literature, its psychological insight remains remarkably accurate. Human beings consistently resist the possibility that compassion might reach beyond the boundaries they themselves would establish. That is one reason the narrative has endured for centuries. It speaks less about fish than about us. There is another uncomfortable possibility worth considering. Perhaps people sometimes insist on literal certainty because symbolic meaning feels insufficient. If Jonah must be historically verified before it can teach anything important, then its value depends entirely on external evidence. But literature throughout history has transformed lives without requiring literal, factual status. Nobody asks whether every detail of a parable actually occurred before learning from it. Stories possess extraordinary power because they organize experience into memorable patterns. Ancient cultures understood this well. They preserved identity through narratives that communicated moral, theological, and existential truths in ways that pure factual reporting rarely achieves. This does not mean all biblical narratives are fictional. It means each text deserves to be read according to its own literary character, rather than according to assumptions imported centuries later. Ironically, some of the fiercest arguments surrounding Jonah may reveal more about modern readers than about the ancient book itself. We live in an age that often assumes every meaningful statement must be categorized as either literal journalism or complete fabrication. Ancient writers operated with a richer spectrum of literary possibilities. Missing that complexity can flatten texts that were deliberately crafted with layers of irony, symbolism, humor, and theological reflection. Whether one ultimately concludes that Jonah records miraculous history or inspired narrative art, reducing it to a debate about digestive systems risks overlooking its central challenge. The book relentlessly asks whether people are willing to confront their own prejudice, pride, and desire for control. That question remains just as unsettling today as it was thousands of years ago. If conversations like this matter to you because you would rather wrestle honestly with difficult questions than settle for comfortable assumptions, consider subscribing and continuing the habit of thinking carefully before deciding what you believe. I want to keep the script consistent with the evidence rather than overstate conclusions. The title says Jonah's story never happened, but that is not something history can establish with certainty. A stronger approach is to continue by examining why many historians and biblical scholars question reading the account as straightforward history, while acknowledging that other scholars and believers interpret it differently. That preserves the dramatic tone without presenting speculation as fact. The moment you begin separating historical evidence from inherited certainty, something unexpected happens. The conversation stops being about whether you are a good believer or a good skeptic, and starts becoming about whether you are intellectually honest. Those are very different questions. Intellectual honesty is willing to admit when the evidence is strong, when it is weak, and when it simply runs out. Most of us are far less comfortable with uncertainty than we pretend. We crave conclusions because conclusions feel safe. Ambiguity feels like standing in the middle of the ocean without seeing land. That emotional discomfort explains why debates about Jonah rarely stay focused on history. They quickly become debates about identity. If someone questions the story, another person hears an attack on faith itself. If someone defends the story, another person assumes they have abandoned reason. Both sides often mistake disagreement over interpretation for disagreement over intelligence. Yet the reality is more complicated. Serious biblical scholarship includes committed believers, agnostics, and non-believers who often agree on many literary observations, even while reaching different conclusions about what those observations ultimately mean. One reason for that agreement is the extraordinary literary sophistication of the book of Jonah. Unlike many historical narratives in the Hebrew Bible, Jonah is remarkably compact, carefully structured, and filled with irony. Nearly every character behaves in a surprising way. The pagan sailors pray while the prophet sleeps. The foreign king humbles himself, while God's own messenger resists his mission. The animals wear sackcloth. The plant appears and disappears, almost like a visual lesson. The final chapter ends, not with resolution, but with a question directed toward the reader. That ending is especially significant because instead of wrapping everything up neatly, it forces the audience to examine themselves. The spotlight quietly shifts away from Jonah and toward whoever is reading the story. That literary technique has led many scholars to suggest that the author's primary concern was not preserving a chronological report, but confronting the reader with uncomfortable moral and theological questions. The fish in that interpretation functions less as the center of the story than as the turning point that allows the deeper conflict to emerge. The real struggle is between justice and mercy, tribal identity and universal compassion, certainty and humility. Even the historical setting contributes to that tension. Nineveh was associated with the Assyrian Empire, a power remembered for conquest and brutality. To an Israelite audience, the idea that God would extend mercy toward such a city would have sounded shocking. Imagine hearing a story in which your nation's greatest enemy receives forgiveness, while your own representative resents it. The emotional force of the narrative depends on that reversal. Whether the events unfolded exactly as described, or whether they were presented in a literary framework designed to communicate a theological truth, the challenge is the same. Human beings often want mercy for themselves and justice for everyone else. That tendency has not disappeared. We still divide the world into people who deserve understanding and people who deserve condemnation. We still assume our group possesses greater moral clarity than those outside it. The story exposes that instinct with remarkable precision. It also invites another uncomfortable question. Why do some people feel threatened by the possibility that a biblical story could communicate profound truth without functioning as modern historical reporting? Part of the answer may lie in how many of us were taught to think. We often inherit the idea that every meaningful statement must fit neatly into categories such as factual history or falsehood. Ancient literature was not always written with those categories in mind. It used narrative, symbolism, poetry, exaggeration, irony, and rhetorical devices to shape the imagination of its audience. Recognizing those features does not diminish the text. In many cases, it reveals how carefully it was composed. That does not require anyone to abandon belief in miracles or divine action. It simply encourages readers to ask what kind of literature they are reading before deciding how it should be interpreted. The deeper lesson may be that our greatest obstacle to discovering truth is not a lack of intelligence, but an unwillingness to question the assumptions we inherited. The most dangerous beliefs are rarely the ones we examined carefully. They are the ones that became invisible because we absorbed them without noticing. That applies to religion, politics, culture, and even our understanding of ourselves. Real growth begins when we become willing to ask difficult questions without assuming that every question already contains its own answer. If these conversations encourage you to examine ideas with curiosity rather than fear, subscribe and continue exploring questions where history, psychology, philosophy, and belief intersect. The irony is that many people assume certainty is the natural destination of honest inquiry, when in reality, honest inquiry often produces humility instead. The deeper you study history, the more you realize that evidence comes in different strengths. Some events are supported by multiple independent contemporary sources. Others rest on a single text, written decades or centuries later. Some are confirmed by archaeology. Others remain impossible to verify or falsify with the evidence currently available. Learning to distinguish between those categories is not an attack on belief. It is simply part of thinking carefully. That is why the discussion surrounding Jonah continues after thousands of years. The evidence does not compel one universally accepted conclusion. Instead, it invites readers to wrestle with questions about genre, intention, theology, and history. For some, the account remains a record of miraculous divine intervention. For others, it is best understood as a profound theological narrative whose power lies in its message rather than in its historical literalness. Still, others hold positions somewhere between those two views. What becomes fascinating is not merely which conclusion a person reaches, but why they reach it. Our conclusions are shaped by much more than facts. They are influenced by family, culture, education, religious tradition, personal experience, and the communities to which we belong. Two intelligent people can examine the same evidence and arrive at different interpretations because they begin with different assumptions about miracles, ancient literature, or the reliability of sacred texts. Recognizing that reality should make us slower to mock and quicker to listen. It should also make us more willing to examine our own reasoning with the same level of scrutiny that we apply to people who disagree with us. That is one of the most difficult intellectual disciplines to develop. We instinctively search for flaws in opposing arguments while overlooking weaknesses in our own. We notice the confirmation bias of others long before we notice our own. Yet genuine curiosity requires the opposite approach. It asks us to become our own toughest critic. If a belief is true, careful examination should not weaken it. If a belief cannot survive sincere questioning, then avoiding those questions never actually protected the truth. It only protected our comfort. That idea extends far beyond religion. We see it in politics when people consume only information that reinforces what they already believe. We see it in relationships when someone ignores obvious warning signs because accepting reality would be emotionally painful. We see it in everyday life whenever familiarity becomes a substitute for evidence. The human mind seeks coherence. It wants a stable story about the world and about itself. There is nothing wrong with that instinct. The danger comes when preserving the story becomes more important than discovering whether the story is accurate. The Book of Jonah, regardless of how one ultimately interprets its historical status, continues to challenge precisely that instinct. It confronts readers with the possibility that they may be resisting uncomfortable truths, not because those truths lack evidence, but because accepting them would require changing how they see themselves or others. That may explain why the ending of the book feels so unusual. Rather than resolving every tension, it leaves the reader with a question that echoes beyond the final sentence. In a sense, the story refuses to let the audience remain passive. It demands self-examination. Are you more concerned with defending your position than understanding someone else's? Do you secretly believe that mercy should be reserved for people you already approve of? Do you mistake confidence for certainty? Do you assume that long-held traditions never deserve fresh examination? Those questions remain powerful, whether one reads Jonah as literal history, theological narrative, or literary masterpiece. They continue to expose patterns of thought that define the human condition. Perhaps that is why the story has endured across centuries and cultures. Not because every reader agrees about what happened, but because nearly every reader eventually recognizes something of themselves within it. The greatest challenge is rarely proving or disproving a single ancient event. The greater challenge is developing the courage to follow evidence where it leads, while remaining humble about the limits of what can actually be known. History can illuminate many things, but it cannot answer every philosophical or theological question. Faith can provide meaning for many people, but it does not eliminate the need for careful reasoning. Skepticism can protect us from accepting claims too easily, but it can become its own form of dogmatism if it refuses to consider possibilities simply because they are unfamiliar. Wisdom often lies not in choosing certainty at all costs, but in learning where certainty is justified, where probability is appropriate, and where intellectual humility is the most honest response. If there is one lasting lesson to take from this discussion, it is that asking difficult questions is not the enemy of truth. Refusing to ask them is. The stories that shape civilizations deserve careful reading rather than automatic acceptance or automatic dismissal. They deserve readers who are willing to distinguish between evidence and assumption, between confidence and proof, between tradition and history. Whether your conclusions ultimately strengthen your existing beliefs or lead you to revise them, the process of examining them honestly is valuable in itself. Reality does not become more or less true because we find it comfortable. It remains what it is, inviting every generation to look again, think again, and question again. And perhaps that willingness to keep asking better questions is far more important than pretending we have already found every answer. If this journey through history, psychology, and interpretation has encouraged you to think more carefully about the stories that have shaped human civilization, subscribe and return for the next conversation. The goal is never to tell you what to believe, but to encourage the kind of careful thinking that makes any belief worth holding.